Let's do it.
To the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
Good morning, everybody. We got Dean again this morning. We missed you last week. Ken did an amazing job filling in, but
He does.
We always miss you, man. We always miss you. How's everything going on in your world?
Yeah, good, great. Good to be back with you. Yeah, I was in Ireland last week, so I have to say I was staring down quite a few pints of Guinness. And
No.
Yeah, as you do. Turns out only 210 calories per pint. And I lost weight. I lost weight over the week. So there you go.
So that's awesome. We want to say good morning, Anton.
Because you didn't eat.
Hey, exactly. You're kind of going from there, right?
Didn't have time to eat.
Yeah, there you go.
It was a lot of
You know
fun.
what? There is calories in beer, right? So you gotta get a little bit in there. But good morning, Anton. Good morning to my sister, Rihanna. Good morning, Lisa. Always here.
Lisa.
And our boy Scott. You know, like today's Data Day.
Yes,
Everyone's
Scott
always
is
excited for
there. I
that.
wonder what happened to Lisa, because usually Lisa's number one, man. This isn't good.
Yeah, I know she's got some competition, man, and you know you were her number one competition, and now she's back to it. So, Data Day, that's what everybody's here for, you know. Like I caught the show yesterday. Dean, it was really awesome to kind of hear the different things going on. But the big thing, you know, let's jump right into it. Hurricane Ian. Fill us in, man. What are you kind of seeing on your end? How can we?
We're starting to see some rate movement. I mean, the first thing is there's a lot of truck stops shutting down. I got some alerts from Flying J that 4 had shut down on the East Coast. So you're starting to see some of that network infrastructure shut down. Ahead of that, there's already power outages this morning deep in Florida. So that generally starts to keep people away, because if you haven't got your tanks full and you get caught down there, you're in a lot of trouble as a trucker. So that's the first thing I look for. I got an email from Averitt yesterday. Averett's a big truckload LTL carrier. They're shut down 4 of their terminals already. Till further notice was the wording they used. So there'll be a lot of inbound. I think there'll be a lot of. The big takeaway is always with hurricanes. There's a lot of network congestion, backlog created. All the inbound loads are being held up. Disruption's the word, Jeff. Thank you. There's a lot of network disruption because in truckload world, a lot of people look for network balance, same number of loads in and out if they can. What we're going to see is the inbound loads will, virtually come to a halt, with the exception of some of the FEMA loads from places like Maxwell Air Force Base, where they stage them for the emergency supplies. But a lot of those loads will be round trip rates, so they'll be loaded in and be paid to deadhead all the way back out. That's generally going to be the rule of thumb for a lot of those loads. So inbound loads will fall right away, and then of course outbound loads will just completely stop. But those outbound loads that I was looking at yesterday that were still moving ahead of the hurricane, like Lakeland to Atlanta, up 30 cents a mile in the last 7 days. That's up to about where it was this time last year. So, but produce season's fallen right away. Lakeland still is a good produce market outbound, but we're at the tail end of produce season by a long shot. Rates in the other direction are not worth talking about. There's not a lot of volume moving, so you can't infer too much from there. So lots of if you're trying to move freight out of there, of course, Ryan, the big thing is you're going to pay for it to move freight out of there, and then there's going to be a lot of rate pressure. I think the biggest thing that's going to happen this week is the disruption to the Atlanta market.
Yeah.
Tallahassee, Tifton, Jacksonville, Miami, Lakeland. Not big markets in the big scheme of things when you think about 135 freight markets in the country at a 3-digit zip code level. Not big markets. Big in produce early in the year, like January, February, March. Lakeland's one of the biggest produce markets. It starts the produce season off. Not so at the moment. But Atlanta is a massive distribution hub for the Southeast.
Yep.
So Atlanta is a top 5 freight market, a lot of inbound, intermodal, and truckload. So it's a massive warehouse location. A lot of freight's going to be backed up. And there's my dogs going off at our heating oil delivery guy delivering just outside my door. It's all. So Atlanta's going to be backed up, and that means that outbound rates out of Atlanta are going to be very high. I suspect next week there'll be a lot of capacity drawn to that area. And it'll need to move quickly. So there'll be a lot of carriers running back and forward, empty back into Atlanta. There's a lot of capacity in the market, especially in the spot market. So I think a lot of the excess capacity will be soaked up. That's a poor use of words, but it will be soaked up into that Atlanta market to relocate a lot of that material. Ryan, what I did notice 2 weeks ago was a lot of inbound flatbed freight into Montgomery, Alabama, the market, right? And Montgomery, of course, is where Maxwell Air Force Base is, where they do all the FEMA staging.
Yep.
So now I can't connect the two directly and say they were all loads going into that market, but you can always see FEMA repositioning loads into a market that's within about 5 hours roughly of where landfall is going to make. Because you can get to the Gulf Coast around Houston or to the Florida Panhandle area pretty quickly from that area. The thought occurred to me as this hurricane was emerging this week was, I wonder if they're thinking they've staged their freight too close to where it's going to make landfall.
Because something too, Dean, that a lot of the electric companies, I know up here in the Northeast, it's all logistics, right? They start pre-staging them, and they're coming in from New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and they start going up that I-95 corridor or a little to the western side, depending upon the path of the hurricane. And you can see them from miles, just waiting for it to pass so they can strike, real quickly. Now, to get back to your flatbed and your van, based upon your experience when hurricanes happen and they went into Galveston or into Louisiana, of course, Florida, what kind of impact can we expect after landfall, and how that's going to impact capacity for X amount of time? Because usually it's like 2 to 3 week time, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it depends on what sort of event this is. It looks like being a flooding event, like a water event. More so than anything, it's the wind damage requires a lot of lumber to rebuild because it's a lot of homes get destroyed by the wind. Flooding is a little bit different. It has a different freight mix in terms of the rebuild effort. But the biggest thing with floods, Jeff, is you physically can't get in there. You've got power lines down. You can't get into back streets to deliver to warehouses. A lot of the people that work in warehouses can't get to work. So everything shuts down for at least 2 to 3 weeks in those particular areas. So this will be a major impact. I think in the flatbed market, mostly because Lakeland, where this is going to take the biggest brunt of the storm, is one of the bigger flatbed markets in the country. Surprisingly, it's consistently throughout the year, a lot of flatbed short haul work out of Lakeland. So yes, it'll be borderline impossible to get into this region for it looks like certainly maybe 10 days to 2 weeks. The way this is shaping up and the level of flooding that's going to occur, mainly because you've got very few roads in and out.
Right.
I think you got 75 and 4 and 95 right at the map. I think they're the major routes.
So 4 goes right through Lakeland. So
right. So once you start to get limited access, it's very hard to get freight in and out. People can't get to work. You can't get into load or unload. So, and then of course the thing that I started the show with is the shutdown of the truck stops, whether they're out because of power, trucks can't get in there to deliver distillates. So it's going to shut this whole freight market down from the Panhandle all the way down. I think it'll impact at least for a couple of weeks. But of course I'm out over my skis here. Sorry to use another water analogy, but it hasn't made landfall yet. We don't really know what the total impact is going to be. But the normal pattern for any hurricane is inbound volumes plummet, so do outbound, and then it gradually picks up in the next couple of weeks after that.
Yeah, because you figure the flatbed alone, and you're right, they're already getting loaded. They're trying to get around that curve rather quickly. So you figure they're getting loaded, they're getting pre-staged. Now they have to sit there and wait. Now with the floods and everything, they're going to wait even longer, which is going to have an impact on the capacity because the capacity is going to tighten up rather quickly because they're going to be sitting still maybe a week or two before those floods subside. So, I mean, minimum 2 to 3 weeks, could be even more, depending upon how fast they can get in there and unload and then get back up to the Atlanta area.
So it's a really good point, Jeff. I hadn't thought about that because what it'll do, it's a bit like the waterbed analogy I've used from the 1980s, right? And I did have a waterbed, absolutely loved it. I'd buy another one today if I could. But when you jump on the waterbed in one area, it just pops up in the other area, right? And capacities like that.
Yeah.
capacity moves around. There's a finite amount of capacity when it sort of it'll move from where it is in New Orleans to another market because they can't go where they would normally go. And an example of that is New Orleans to Lakeland. It's a big flatbed market. Rates are up 20, 40. They're up 60 cents a mile in the last 7 days for flatbed loads from New Orleans to Lakeland. So that tells you what the carriers are saying. Yeah, we're not interested in going there at some point. And when you look at telematics data, when you look at the long plot from ELDs around hurricane areas, what you see is this big void, right, where there's no dots on a map in the flooded areas. I remember when the floods, there was one on the East Coast. There was a flooding event. It was a Cat 5 in September 17. I think it was one of those ones. It was a big water event that flooded sort of It was? Okay. So when you looked at the long plot, so we studied it for 2 or 3 weeks. When the hurricane hit, suddenly all of the dots on the map just vanished. And Jeff, it was at like a 150-mile radius. There was nothing. You could see some trucks running up and down 95, the interstate guys, but there was nothing east of I-95 in the flooded area. But it took a couple of weeks for the dots to gradually trickle back into the map. And it's because a flooding event, you physically couldn't get in there even if you wanted to. And that's what I think people are going to face this week is if it's a flooding event primarily, and it certainly looks like that, it's going to take a while for people to be able to get back in.
Yeah, and you know something too, a lot of these truck drivers out there, even if the water subsides, especially on the coast side, and you've got that salt water coming in, those guys don't want to drive through that salt water, even though they know their truck can, because that salt water can wreak havoc on their chassis and everything, and it's going to cost them a lot of money to flush their chassis out and all this, because they surely don't want to drive around with a soaked salt frame. So
it's awful, Jeff.
It's awful.
The brine they use on the interstate highways today is one of the biggest problems you've got because it eats away all your wiring.
Oh,
it does damage to the paint. But on my Peterbilt, I've got a stainless steel bumper at the back with 7 LEDs in it, and I have to rewire that every year. Rewire the lights because even though I've got it sealed with silicon, the brine gets in from the roads and it eats away the wiring. It's absolutely devastating. So it's a really good point because if you run into that area, you'll have to hit a truck wash, and there's $120 to clean it off.
Yeah, because a lot of these guys are using this paint called Emeron, and it's an acid-resistant type paint that you could literally take your battery, crack it in half, and pour it on the frame, and it's not going to do anything. And it costs a hell of a lot of money to put that on a car. I can't even imagine what it would have cost to do that to a frame of a truck. But these guys, when I see trucks going through, high tide water, I've seen that next to the shore because they think they can go through it. And it's like, dude, man, you should not be doing this.
The other thing they're going to do is I haven't caught up on the news because I've been away, but I guess there'll be an exemption to hours of service in those areas for all the FEMA relief efforts. That sort of comes with the territory.
That just like PPE, right? It's like the PPE, what they did, during the pandemic. They'll do the same thing.
Yeah, they'll let you run. They'll sort of give you an exemption for the hours of service. Normally it's for like a month, which is sometimes it tells you. Sometimes they extend that beyond a month. It tells you how much damage there's been in that particular area. So there'll be an exemption for a lot of carriers. There's, this is a time when carriers will in the spot market in particular do exceptionally well for those loads where they can run those emergency loads in. You got to know what you're doing though, is because of the water and the infrastructure. You got to know the roads. You might not have power. You might not have navigation. You've got to be really well prepared to run into these sorts of environments. So it's not for brand new drivers to the industry. That's for sure.
But look at this too, Dean. Think about the docks are wiped out. You're trying to get flatbed moves in to get offloaded. So now you have to rent cranes potentially to pull this stuff off the flatbed. All the coordination is going to, have tremendous downtime for these flatbed drivers. Besides just driving in there and waiting, there's so many other trigger mechanisms that have to be, logistically put in place to move this product besides the flatbed alone. So
that's power. Right? I think power is going to be the big limiting factor here, not just the physical limitations of water damage, but the wind damage and the loss of power is going to be, I think, a big factor for just in terms of not being able to mobilise. I have to say, I do feel for people that decided. The one thing that caught my attention was all the high rises that have been built in Florida, and people on social media staying in their high rise. And of course, you think, well, there's wind, right? I'm not sure. I've never been there, so I can't speak for what people should or shouldn't do. But if there's a storm surge of the level they're talking about, you're kind of on an island, literally. Like, how do you? There's a lot of people caught like this because there's so much development going on.
And to that point, Dean, I have a lot of friends that live down there. Yeah. And I spoke with them over the last couple of days, and they said going into Publix is a big shopping center down in Florida. They said it was crazy. The shelves are getting barren. Everybody is trying to, pack up the food. So to your point, Dean, if you're stuck on an island, how are you going to get the food, your milk, whatever it might be? Plus the sewage system as well. I mean, if you think about that, right? I mean, I don't know. I think I would get the hell out of Dodge.
We've got some good friends that live in down near Sanibel Island, Cape Coral, and they're well into their late 70s and not in good health, and they've typically just said, we'll just ride it out. I was really surprised by how many Floridians had been through hurricanes and just were kind of blasé about it, and I thought, well, you've been through it for most of your life then, but when I called them yesterday, they were already southbound into Miami to get away from that. And I thought, well, that's interesting because there's storm surge and flooding going to happen, all over the area. But these were folks that were pretty resilient and had always stayed there. Now they're on a canal system that wouldn't take 6 feet of water to come into their house. So they were smart. But think about, that they are, and there's a lot of retired people that live in Florida too.
Elderly.
So even more at-risk communities. So this is not going to be a lot of fun for people. So
no, but they put a lot of pressure, to your point about the elderly, about emergency services, police, fire, when people have a heart attack or something, because it does happen during these type of storms. How are they going to get in there to pick these people up to save their lives? I mean, you really got to start thinking, logically about this, and why they stay in them. I don't know. It just takes one bad event. Maybe they went through 5 of them and they felt, no problem. We've done this over 20, 30 years, never had an issue until that one time. Yeah. And then you're really screwed or dead.
Well, it was 4 years ago that the last hurricane hit the East Coast. So it was 4 years ago. So there's sort of this recency bias where people, it hasn't happened for a while. They probably come a little bit complacent. Maybe they're not as prepared as they should. So, but so this is one of those things. I was speaking at the Journal of Commerce Inland Distribution Conference yesterday in Chicago. There's about 600 people in the audience, all shippers and all modes of transport. And one of the things that kind of struck me was how the freight market has been impacted by hurricanes in the past. If you think about the 2018 freight cycle. And this, so, I think if our audience is sort of listening and thinking, well, what do hurricanes do to the broader market? In 2017, we had 2 big hurricanes hit in September and 1 in August. So I think August was Harvey, and then we had 2 in September. And I distinctly remember in September, the flatbed market took an enormous amount of demand to help in the rebuilding effort of those particular hurricanes in late 2017. And then the flatbed market just took off all the way through 2018. And 2018 was a very strong year from a demand perspective, but it was primarily an industrial economy driven freight market. It was a huge market for flatbed carriers. And spot rates in flatbed were higher than contract for the best part of 8 months of that year. And it wasn't until September in 18 that the market really started to cool down. But it started with some massive hurricanes. And that's the thing that you look at the polar vortex event. The freight market never recovered from that event was it February 21, right? So, we lost about 7 to 8% of our capacity, disappeared off the roads for about a week. I calculate it by the number of miles traveled using those passive highway counters data, where they measure the number of truck passes, and I calculated it was a significant drop. And then the freight market never recovered from that. Like, the rates just kept going up after that. So big events like this have a profound impact on markets, in terms of the movement in capacity where it shifts, and then the impact on spot rates. I think the one thing I'm very cognizant of is that we've been forecasting that spot rates at about $1.85, excluding fuel. So these are line haul spot rates at $1.85 this week. They've got about 5 cents per mile to drop in our short-term forecast between now and Thanksgiving, right? So there's still some room for them to go down. But events like this have the ability to change things around almost immediately.
Oh yeah.
So it wouldn't be surprising. A lot of isolated events can become regional events. When they become regional events, they have the tendency to create this inflationary effect on national rates. Right? It's a bit like port volumes that surged into the West Coast. It was like the pulse of the entire trucking industry, from an import perspective. Even though imports only account for about 10% of all truckload volume, just the volume of freight hitting small port markets, I would say small in terms of volume, small geographically, it had a profound impact on national rates because the volumes and rates were so good out of those areas, and it attracted capacity in to take advantage of those rates. So I'll know Sunday morning when I crunch the numbers what the impact of this week will be. On next week's show, we'll be able to dissect exactly what the impact will be of this particular event. Be interested to see if it moves the needle nationally. It could do. I think there's a good chance it will, because of the Atlanta Southeast market in particular, because that's just a huge freight market for everybody. Because railroads will be impacted. You've got Florida East Coast, some big short line railroads running up and down there. They will be impacted considerably. So
the Florida Railway, CSX, Norfolk Southern, all down there. But you know what? When you think about this logically as well, right? So the capacity starts tightening up with the flatbeds because they're all inbound to Florida and up and down the East Coast, right? So the shippers can't normally ship what they normally ship during the week, every day or whatever, right? So they're sitting on that supply, right? That product until the flatbed opens up. Now they get pounded. So, a 3-week event becomes a 6-week event because now they're offloading that FEMA and response supplies, and now they have to go to the customers who are open that can ship. Now they're getting loaded and going out, as soon as possible. And the increase in the number of shipments are going to just explode. I mean, you can just see it logically, because what goes in has to go out, and it's going to tighten up real quick.
Yeah. I was fascinated. I've been watching, and I just sent you. I hope you can load this. But what you see is that same effect I showed you with ELD, where all of the ships. There's no ships in the path of this hurricane right now off the Gulf Coast, but I've been watching all the ships and this is interesting. There's a massive outflow of ships heading out of Savannah. I wouldn't say what I've been waiting for. This hurricane is expected. There's a good chance. Oh, so you can see it there. Okay, so you can see on the map there, if you look to the east of Florida, you can see the big void. So this is where the ship traffic is avoiding that area. So that's where the hurricane is going to go. And the ships will fill back in as the hurricane moves north. But Ryan, if you could zoom up to Savannah, it's interesting. There's a significant number of vessels going outbound out of there.
There you go.
And what they're doing,
because
this hurricane is going to cross Florida's panhandle, then come back in and make landfall again, or potentially make landfall again. Where it's coming in is over Savannah, where they've had 35, 40 vessels at anchor. The big issue with this storm is they'll start dragging anchors. So I think what they're looking to do by the look at this is to reposition to another anchorage area further out to sea, out of the storm's path. That's what looks like happening there this morning.
Yep, that's what it looks like right there. Look at that.
Yeah.
It looks like, just from those arrows, it looks like there's more outbound than inbound, for sure.
Well, and I looked at this yesterday.
Yeah,
I looked at this yesterday, and all these dots were stationary. They weren't moving. So you can see even down at Brunswick, Jacksonville. You can see more outbound than inbound. So yes, ships are getting out of the way. So again, this is another thing that will have impact, because we've still got peak season imports sort of surging into the country, or we're at the peak. So volumes will start to come down, but this is the peak volume that the Port of Savannah has been talking about, that where you've got all these vessels sitting trying to get unloaded at the port, having to move offshore further to avoid the hurricane will just mean that you've now got more delays for a lot of those. So this is another.
It kind of looks like Long Beach, doesn't it, Dean?
Well, I got the email this morning. There's only 11 vessels off Long Beach this morning.
Yeah, so. That's my point, because I mean, remember when we were discussing that, and we're seeing those volumes switch to Houston, Savannah, and into New York. Well, here you go, folks. I mean, it's just it's crazy how that shift is happening. It's just,
if you go up to New York is a pretty good port. It's unusual to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Unusual to see 10 vessels at anchor off Long Beach, New York. That is, very unusual to see that many vessels there. Yeah. So that just tells you about the west to east shift that's been going on. All of the congestion we had on the west coast, of course, is now bottled up over here. At the conference yesterday, Jeff, it was interesting. I'd love your perspective on this. Larry Gross was speaking about some of the inland congestion. He said things are easing. Intermodal traffic volumes, even though they're down year over year, the velocity of the trains is increasing, and the number of number of trains that are late outside of 24 hours from their projected time of arrival is improving. So he's saying that things are improving in terms of the congestion side of things. I don't know what you're hearing, but I thought it was interesting.
They still have the congestion over there, from what I'm hearing. A lot of the warehouses are still maxed out, and it's very, very difficult to find space. Right. That's what I've heard, and I spoke to some people that are in the international business out here, and they still have issues. Is it starting to subside a little bit, but not where they need to be? Right. I mean, it is every single port. I mean, congestion in warehouse space is the number one problem. And that's the reason why a lot of these companies out there, builders, are looking for land to build more warehousing. And I think I said to you, I think it was Prologis or something several months ago, where they said that they're going to need over the next 10 years, I think, 1 billion square feet of warehouse. Just think of that. 1 billion square feet. I mean, it's just crazy. Who would ever think that this industry would explode that big? I mean, the consumer demand, that's telling them to build 1 billion square feet of warehousing. That's crazy.
I often wonder, you look at this and say, well, how did we not realize that we were going to end up with bloated inventories if we ordered all this stuff from overseas? Like, how did we think this was going to happen? And then, of course, we've got deep discounting going on, reported in the Wall Street Journal today, people trying to move all of this inventory. But I heard something yesterday from the senior economist at Journal of Commerce, who's part of IHS Markit / Standard & Poor's, right? So these are really smart economists. Paul Bingham was presenting with me yesterday at the JOC event. And he was talking about next year, because I've been very concerned about demand next year, because if you take the excessive inventory, high inflation, deep discounting, you can kind of read the tea leaves and see what's happening. So I think, reasonably good year from a freight perspective this year. I'm more worried about next year. And what Paul said was he expects a recession, and a lot of senior economic forecasters are talking about a recession in the early part of 2023, which is somewhat manufactured, right? So we are. This has been created to try and take the heat out of the economy. What he did say, I thought was fascinating. Even though technically it will be 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, he said it'll be very, very shallow. And I thought that was very interesting, because whenever I hear that word, that R word, I get very, very nervous. mostly because I don't
Right.
understand it because I'm not an economist, but it just doesn't sound good, right? But what he
No.
did say was it'll be very shallow, and we will start to see a serious return to normalcy, both in labour markets and in the economy. But he was talking about the first half of next year. So I think that's what I'm from a trucking perspective. You could see rates fall even further in the first part of next year, both on the contract and the spot side, before the market starts to get into its next cycle.
Right.
So, but
Well, that's kind of typical, right? I mean, the
exactly,
first quarter of a new year, and
yeah,
also what kind of dictates the pace too, is the reverse logistics from the fourth quarter when everybody buys all their supplies and everything, Christmas gifts, whatever, and then they do a lot of return on that. So
right,
that kind of tells you, um, how much the consumer spent, around the holidays, and then that return. And it's always been like that over the last several years.
It's
It's
a
a good
great point.
indicator.
Well,
Yeah.
it's a great point. We had a guest on our show last week who's an LTL expert, and one of the things I've been noticing is because return season is going to drive a lot of LTL volume, right?
Yeah.
You see, but already LTL volumes are exceeding capacity. When you talk to anybody in the LTL space, capacity is very tight. There's still a lot of LTL volume in the market, so
Right.
that could mean that the truckload market where we kind of sit, I think it'll be fairly lean next year. Now, I talked to Chris Jolly yesterday, the freight coach from. He runs a really good show, and Chris was saying
Yes.
that we were talking about the same subject, and he said, "But remember, the start of next year is going to see all of these contract rates in the routing guides that are being negotiated today.
Mm-hmm.
So next year's contract rates, which are 90% of the freight moved roughly, are being negotiated now in a very different market than it could be next year." And
Yep.
he said if spot rates sort of drop, then you could see shippers want to try and move volume on the spot market to take advantage of spot rates that are lower than contract rates negotiated today. And
Right. And you know what? I mean, the spot market, right? When that spot market starts falling, it
yeah,
kind of pulls that contract rates down as well.
Yep.
I mean, that's usually the case on that. But talking about the RFPs and all of that, I mean, long-term contractual agreements, I just don't see. I don't know what your thoughts are about this, Dean, but I mean, I just can't see the sustainability of a long-term RFP, for annual business, because it's just
right,
it's a huge wave. There's the peaks are higher and the valleys are lower than
right,
we've ever seen before. It's just all over the board. So how can you sustain that and
yeah,
actually put a number to a contract where you're not going to lose your shirt,
right.
whether it's on the shipper side or the carrier side?
Well, Chris said exactly that. It was fascinating. He almost said he could see 30-day contracts, right? So it's real dynamic pricing. So, but it was interesting. The data I shared yesterday, I'll just pull up the numbers, because to your point, Jeff, you remember spot rates have dropped 32% on dry vans since the start of the year. So they're down about 92 cents a mile. So they've been sort of dropping consistently. But it's only just in the last month that contract rates are starting to drop. Right, so there's a lag, and we always said 4 to 6 months, and it's kind of tracking about that. But contract rates entering routing guides in the last 2 weeks. So these are contract rates negotiated at a prior time. New contract rates negotiated in the last quarter are coming into routing guides for contract loads 8% lower than the start of September, and in reefer 13% lower. So contract rates are starting to turn, and you'll see there's always a lag between the two peaks in rates. There's kind of a double hump, but they're offset, if you could visualize what that means. And then over time, contract rates will start to sort of lag and then follow. The thing that's different this year around is that we won't see the low point in contract rates for all of you negotiating capacity. We won't see the drop in contract rates bottom out lower than any previous freight cycle in the last 5 years. So the lows of 19, rates aren't going back to where they were in 19, is my point, on the low side. So even our low point forecasts next year are still higher than 2019. The real reason is you pay for it at the checkout. We're all paying a lot more for everything. the operating costs to run my truck are up 25 cents a mile in the last year.
Yeah.
I'm at $2 a mile today. Of the 25 cents a mile increase in operating cost, 23 of that's diesel. Right, so it's costing everybody a lot more to run trucks. I think there's a lot more carriers who are doing cost plus pricing. We've covered this before on the show.
Yep.
But you're paying, I'm paying $1,500 to fill up my 2 tanks on my truck. When you pay 4 figures to fill up your truck every 3 days, it's in your face when you are talking to anybody about a load price, the load haul freight.
Yep.
This is a very different market than before, when diesel was much lower and you could say, oh yeah, I'll just take that load and run for fuel money. You need a lot of revenue on your load to pay for fuel these days. And that's what's different this rate cycle. Everybody is now saying, hey, well, hold on, I can't run for that rate. If you want me to haul 1,000 loads a week on this lane as a big contract carrier and a big shipper, this is the rate, because I've got to pay my drivers 61 cents a mile. I'm paying the best part of 70 cents a mile for diesel. It's costing me $1.30 a mile just to run down the road before I even pay my driver. Like when I look at my fixed and variable costs. So these are very different times, and I think it's important for anybody dealing with your shippers right now is to remember that this is a different market cycle because of what it's costing everybody to.
Yeah, and you know something too, Dean, to your point on that RFP. To build those long-term business relationships with your customers that you're doing business with, I would highly advise that you revisit the contract rates and say, listen, if I put these contract rates in place, let's touch base in 2 months from now. Let's revisit, let's see how the market is turning. Let's see what fuel is doing. And if we need to adjust, we will adjust, because this will help out the carrier as well as yourself. Right. And it will build a much longer term relationship by doing so. Are you okay with that? Just be totally upfront. Because the thing is that if you don't work with the carriers and the carriers are losing money, they're going to jump ship and they're going to come back and say, you know what? Listen, I know I gave you these great rates and everything, but I looked at my OR and it just went up 14%. So, it's the cost of goods sold, COGS, right? I'm going to have to raise your prices. If you want me to continue moving your freight, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, because you can't work in a negative environment. I mean,
no.
You can't.
Well, nobody wins in that point, right? Like you're there's no reason to work, if you're just in the negative completely, right? And
you're hurting yourself.
You're hurting yourself. You're kind of cutting yourself. You're cutting your arm off. And one thing I've kind of learned here is that, like some customers and prospects I've reached out to, they've already completed their RFP cycles. They're ready to go basically November 1st, December 1st. And it's like, well, hey, we're going to have these conversations, because a big thing too is like getting to the next point, kind of segueing a bit, but like Canada dropping their vaccine requirement October 1st. They're one of the last countries to do it. And I know personally, because I do quite a bit of cross border, is, hey, those Ohio markets, those PA markets, those short haul markets, we've saw those rates really increase. Like we're paying like maybe 25, 26 USD to Toronto or something like that. And it's just not feasible anymore. So I know everywhere we've had the impacts, but those have really had it too. So you got to, just for everybody kind of watching today, like have these discussions with your customers. I personally, I don't know if you guys kind of do this too, but I send Wednesday, like the YouTube link, I send them to my customers and, hey, take a look at this point, timestamp 5 minutes and 20 seconds or whatever, when Dean's talking about this or anything like that. It's just beneficial for yourself to be educated.
Yeah. Get as much. I mean, I tell you, one of the good shows that it's a really good show. It's a shameless plug for our own organisation, but FreightVine, right? So FreightVine is we have our chief data scientist is Professor Chris Kaplis. He's also a professor at MIT, but he does a podcast every 2 weeks called FreightVine, where he has a shipper on. So he has one of our shipper customers on, talking about their world. And he had Newell Brands on just recently talking about how they've adapted during the whole pandemic. So it's a great podcast. Odd Lots is another really good podcast. There's a lot of great podcasts that you should be listening to. I think I just soak in information from every possible source I can, because you just never know what you're going to pick up that might just change your view of the world or give you a nugget of information that might help you in a sales discussion. It's one of the great benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. In this business, you learn every day. I don't care how long you've been in the business, but if you're not learning something new every day, you're not learning anything. I mean, You need to do that. You need to get, instead of having your single perspective, you need other perspectives as well. So then you can gather all that information and make a logical assumption based on that and saying, here's what I think based upon what I'm hearing, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a great point. Everybody should be doing that.
It's why I get in my truck and bang around on the weekend on the highways, because it's a reality check, right? It's, to me, I have all this data at my disposal. I hear all these things, and then I'll just go out and hang out in the truck stop for a while. I'll check out what's really going on, and man, do you find out really quickly what's really going on. And it's because it's a very different world. There's a big disconnect between what goes on the road and what happens sort of in our world, you know, not driving. It's still pretty tough out there for drivers. I've got to say, we had Driver Appreciation Week a little while ago. It's really good that the Canadian government's relaxed that mandate across the border.
It is.
You know, so Ryan, it's a good, interesting question. I talked to Chuck Snow, and I think he's been on the show here with Dan. Chuck Snow from Traffics. Chuck said that, and this was in February when the cross-border protests were going on.
Right. He
said conservatively, we've lost about 20% of our cross-border drivers, and who no longer will cross the border. And when I spoke to him about 6 weeks ago, he said that's still in effect. So it'll be interesting to see. And what he predicted back in February happened. He said more capacity will stay in Canada, rates will drop, and rates will go up across the border because capacity is tightened because there's fewer drivers. So it'll be interesting to see how that transpires now into some of the cross-border rates. Now that more cross-border capacity in terms of drivers is coming back into the market. That's certainly really good news for the cross-border market.
Yeah. And what I kind of saw in February too, just to go on that point, like I've had prospects that I've never talked to, like, you know, like talked to on the phone. Like I just sent out an intro email and that was it. No reply, no nothing. Them reaching out to me for capacity, you know, and then we're kind of seeing people just kind of go back to their usual carriers because now the capacity will kind of come in. You're right, because like my mindset was that when this whole vaccine thing was that everyone kind of made a big rah-rah about it, like, hey, shelves are going to be empty, you know, it's going to be a big thing, everything's going to slow down. But I personally, like, we didn't see that in Toronto, you know. I don't there's never been a time I went to the grocery or went to anything and anything was completely out of stock. But we saw that in terms of freight, right? The pricing, right? You look at, let me look at like an example here in Wisconsin, like either a can of baked beans, like a truckload of baked beans, they were put on the back shelf, right? Because they're such a low cost item, right? Compared to like the other things, like let's say construction that's moving, that had to move urgently, right? So those things had to take a back seat in what I personally seen, and they've just kind of went with the lowest, cheapest option, like, hey, this can sit, you know? So it's kind of like going from there.
Yep. So one of the lanes that we talked about on the show was we called it Auto Alley, Laredo to Toronto, with a lot of the cross-border auto parts.
Yep.
And so when we talked about this in March and April, rates were excluding fuel, northbound $3 a mile, and historically it's been about $1.30 a mile. So they doubled, more than doubled when the cross-border protests hit. They are back at $1.55 today. So they're back around the long-term average on that northbound lane, which tells you something about how now that's spot market capacity, right? So when you look at the rate directionality of a spot market, the spot market tells you about how tight capacity is on the contract market also, because when your contract carriers can't find drivers to run south, you've got fewer trucks to run north out of Laredo, and it flows over to the spot market. So the spot market's like a very reactionary market to how the broader market's working. Those rates have come right back down to normal. The other one was Detroit. Detroit really suffered from a lot of that steel movement, and it's back to $944. It's back to $802 a load. So that market has calmed right down also. But yeah, that market took an absolute beating anywhere around March, April, as that capacity just vanished from the cross-border market.
Yeah, and even to that, because we do a little bit of LTL, like 2-3 pallets every week, out of Laredo back into Toronto, and what we've seen, we've used like the LTL carriers, like a Polaris or like a Dan Ross and stuff like that. They're having trouble finding partners, like their carrier partners in those areas to pick up. So like our service has kind of gone down, but they've kind of understood that, hey, the rate, the difference between the LTL carrier and actually putting it on like an LTL consolidation truck, it's too much for them, and with the cost of goods to actually go ahead and put it on there. So everywhere's kind of feeling that. Like I've personally seen the struggles with, like, let's say the Polaris, the Dan Ross, the Sayas, and things like that from their end.
Yeah, look what Dan said. Dan said that months ago. Remember, I think he mentioned Challenger. which is a huge, right? Challenger is a huge carrier up there in the flatbed. And he said, you know, in the Edmonton area or the surrounding areas around Edmonton, it was tight. Couldn't find any flatbeds or anything. I mean, it was just bad. I mean, real bad. And now things are starting to open up a little bit.
I think Challenger got bought out, right? I think they got acquired by a different company, or I'm probably thinking of somebody else.
Challenger?
Yeah,
part of it did, right? Part of the company did that. Dan sold part of it.
Yeah,
I can't remember the company name though.
Yeah, I can't forget.
No, I remember him saying something about that.
Fast Freight. It was Fast Freight. And Fast Freight's like a TL consolidated company as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just on that LTL, we had Nicole Glenn on our show, and I don't know if you wanted to watch it, but the week before last, on September 20, we had Nicole Glenn. She's an expert sort of in this LTL space. She was speaking about that same challenge. It's a very different market. They've had a lot of challenges, they've had to deal with in the last couple of years. That's the thing that surprised me, is how busy the LTL carriers are. I suspect they're challenged too by the mix of freight and the driver issues. Issues. I say issues. It's trying to find drivers. A lot of drivers retired. In the last couple of years, everybody's struggling to try and find drivers that are willing to work.
Especially with LTL too, right? That can be a little bit tricky, right? If you got these multi-stops and everything like that, and got to bring it to a DC, like just that kind of aggravation that goes on with LTL, it even makes it more difficult.
Yeah.
Yep.
I saw something that's kind of worth talking about. It's not a data point, but I was watching a video of a trucker last night, and he was videoing a forklift in a truck stop. It was in Sapp Brothers in Denver. I wouldn't say the ground is very level, but anyway, he had a jersey barrier. You guys all know what a jersey barrier is. I'm not sure if that's a New England term. The big concrete barriers they use to divide roads.
Oh yeah, sure. Dividers, yeah, concrete dividers. Yeah,
they're called jersey barriers here in New England. That's probably the wrong term nationally. But anyway, the forklift is bringing the jersey barrier over in the truck park, and he puts the jersey barrier in front of another truck who's in bed sleeping. The driver's sleeping. And he blocks the guy in because they didn't pay for the parking and they didn't buy any fuel. And so you think, wow, that's a bit mean. So how do you avoid that? Well, if you've got a bull bar, or what I think you call them a brush bar here, that's pretty easy to push it out of the way. But the point is that this is what things have got to for truck drivers. You don't think about this much now, but they're now being pushed to pay for parking everywhere they go. And if you think about it, if you haven't bought $50 worth or 50 gallons worth of diesel, I can totally understand why the truck parking location is wanting to say, hey, we're not a public parking space, which is how it's been viewed historically. This is a really big change that's been going on for the last 5 to 6 years. So now you've got to add another $150 a week to the cost of moving freight, because drivers have got to pay for parking every single night. There's another cost that drivers have got to go through. Not only is parking limited, the parking that you do get, you've got to book and pay for. And there's so much that's changed in our industry over the last, certainly in the 22 years I've been here. It's just been unbelievable, the amount of change. It's a hard job, and this is why long haul truckload capacity, I think, will be tight forever. It's such a hard job. And it's such a difficult job to keep drivers, and the companies really struggle to get drivers the miles they need, because shippers keep them. One of the things, if you listen to the ATBS webinar last week, ATBS is the premier accounting financial firm out of Denver for owner operators and small fleets. Last year, if you remember, last year, carriers made owner operators average income was about $70,000 a year. That's profit. Before tax. This year it's about $69,000. It's about $1,000 left. So revenue was up 23% last year. Costs were up 26% last year. Miles were down 11%. And the overwhelming response to miles being down was we had to spend more time unloading and loading at shippers and receivers. Yeah. And of course,
that's always been an issue.
It's bigger the DC, the more windows that they got open, the longer they're going to stay there. Which is
they don't see any urgency about doing it. It's more advantageous for the shipper, or the consignee, to take their time, and instead of just taking those pallets and put it on the staging dock for outbound, They take it and they run it right into the inventory and they put it right into the racks, instead of trying to offload real quick and do that later. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it costs them money. It costs them money to do that. They don't realize the detention and everything. It's ridiculous.
Because the driver turnover gets baked into the operating cost that goes into the next RFP. So, and you end up on the 4-letter word list. You don't want to be a shipper on that list because you're going to find it hard to get trucks to do anything for you. Anyway, the point of the webinar was that carriers are still doing really well, despite all the doom and gloom and all the clickbait media. Carriers had a really strong year on the non-public company side because the public companies have all been very open and transparent about how well they're doing. They've had a really good 18-month period up until June this year. I don't see that changing. And owner-operators who, of course, were forecast to be decimated 3 or 4 months ago, that hasn't happened because, again, they had one of the best years they've ever had financially. And one of the things that has happened, we talked about it on the show, after such a good year financially, anecdotally, I was seeing drivers say, you know what, I'm just going to sit at home and ride this out. I am not going to go out and because they can afford to. Last year was a very different year for carriers. It was one of the best years financially. So our trucking industry is in really good shape. I think what the next trigger we want to watch for on the show in terms of where rates go next year in the spot market is when we start to see new truck order cancellations. So we've had a lot of truck orders, a lot of issues trying to get trucks out of factories. We saw it in 2019. If you remember, we had record orders in 2018. Then we saw cancellations start to creep in. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, because it'll help moderate the supply of trucks coming into the industry. We are only slightly oversupplied right now is how I view the market. We have an excess of trucks, but it's not crazy like it was in 2019, right? So yes, we have an oversupply of trucks in certain markets, but things aren't as bad nearly as what some in the media would make out. So I think the trucking industry is in pretty good shape. The first quarter of next year is going to be a real tell, I think, in terms of what next year shapes up as.
Something, Dean, just real quick, to go back to what you're talking about, drivers, parking, there's expenses and stuff. You know what I've been seeing lately? I've been seeing, especially on I-95 and 80, these drivers are pulling over in the emergency lane, and I'm seeing more and more of them lined up at 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, sleeping there to kind of, cost avoidance.
We're actually seeing that in Toronto, too.
Yeah, you're seeing more and more of that.
It's the unintended consequence of the ELD mandate, right? Where to avoid a violation, you can't move the truck. They call it the ELD crawl, right? Because if you can crawl along at under 5 miles an hour, you won't trigger the ELD on duty status. So a lot of guys, so you'll see them in traffic crawling along at under 5 miles an hour, so they can conserve time. It's absolutely madness. Yesterday in Chicago, I saw this truck pulled over and it was a breakdown lane, but it was a little bit wider than normal on the top of a bridge, and it was it was on 94 South, just next to Chicago's downtown. And I thought, what's this guy doing parked right there? Anyway, all the curtains were drawn at like 10 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, he's taking his break on the side of the freeway. And you see it. I spoke to Mass DOT downtown here about this, because when the ELD mandate came in, I saw an uptick in the number of drivers at 7 hours and 59 minutes pulling over for their half-hour break, realizing they were about to go into violation because they didn't have their 30-minute break. And they would pull over almost on the fog line and they'd be sitting there having their 30-minute break. And it's one of those unintended consequences of the ELD mandate, which is it hasn't made us safer. It's caused drivers to rush more, take more risks, compress more work into a finite window. But if you look in the insurance world, one of the longest tail claims outside of work comp is the high-speed rear end of a parked truck on the interstate. Because when a car hits the back of a truck, those claims go on for years, and litigation is.
And you know what? I remember when they installed the ICC bar. Because a lot, to your point, cars were going underneath the back of the truck, and as gross as it is, people are getting decapitated because they're hitting these trucks at 50, 60 miles an hour. And that's why they wanted those impact ICC bars down the side of the trailer too, so they don't go underneath that. Like, what do they call them? The skirts, I guess, on the side. like
Yeah.
an ICC bar down here?
Yeah, ICC bar is what it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this gives you an insight into why drivers see a disconnect between, yeah, we want you to be safe and productive, yet you go out on the road, you think, how do I deal with all this? I've got limited parking opportunities, not enough rest areas. I get into violation. I could lose my job if I go over 8 hours and 1 minute. It's absolutely madness out there. So
yeah,
that's why
you're riding a double-edged sword. That's what you're doing. You're riding a double-edged sword. It's damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Exactly.
It's terrible.
Yeah, we definitely see that here, and we're gonna wrap it up here because I know everybody's kind of getting ready to actually send this off to the day. Dean, before we let you go, I know next week is a huge week for DAT. You can tell us a little bit about DATCon. We can mention it last week, but if you can give some details, are you gonna be doing the show next week from there, or how are we doing that?
It's a good question. I hadn't thought about it. I'll be in another time zone. No, I'll be on. No, I'll be here. I'll just be in a hotel room. So yeah,
Perfect.
no, I wouldn't miss this for the
There
world.
you go.
So yeah, DATCon is our user conference. We haven't had it for 2 years because of the pandemic. We have, I think, about 230 people registered now. Maybe it's probably more. So it's our user conference. It's where all of our customers come. We've got a bunch of speakers lined up where we talk about what's happening in the spot market world, the contract freight market. We've got Shipper Day is Wednesday, so a lot of our shippers are coming in just to talk about the shipper side of the world.
That's
Thursday
good.
will be more on the other side. Tim DeNoyer is going to be there from ACT Research. They're our long-term forecasting partners. We've just today we'll be announcing a partnership with them where they're the dominant player in the truck and trailer order space.
Nice.
Tim's also a really good long-term forecaster, and he's going to be doing a session on what the long-term outlook looks. When I say long-term, he's talking 3 to 5 years, what the market looks like based on the supply of trucks. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, there you go.
No,
You can still
It's
register.
gonna be awesome. I wish I would be able to go.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, want to thank everybody for coming out. This is honestly one of the best days of the week where you get all your data in. We are going to be hitting the replay at 12 Eastern and 3 p.m. Eastern time again. We're going to be on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, tell everybody, tell all your customers, tell your carriers, tell everybody about the show because it definitely brings some value. Thank you, Dean, for always being here. It's always a pleasure to have you on here. Jeff, always a pleasure, man. You always adding value. So, with that, we're going to take you out. Everybody enjoy the rest of your week and hope to see Dean next week at DATCon in the background.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have a great day, guys. Thanks.
Centurion Trucking. Our motto is people before profit. Today's market requires more transparency, consistency, and focus on what our clients need to win. Centurion Trucking and American Logistics are poised to help their clients achieve and surpass their targets. If you're looking for a team that honors your needs, dreams, and aspirations, then get a hold of Daman at American Logistics.